election is certainly one of the most difficult ideas the history of philosophy has had to deal with. Firstly, because it is not a philosophical idea. It doesn't provoke the referentiality we could evoke when approaching traditional or classical philosophical concepts. Furthermore, and to render the situation more complex, few authors in the ontotheological tradition have spoken of election. Perhaps all have presupposed the idea of election, but few have actually sought to furnish it its philosophical ground or foundation. That is, few authors have spoken of this idea positively. We could certainly evoke Schelling, Hölderlin in a more ethnocentric, nationalistic signification, but other than these two figures, one would certainly find it difficult to furnish a rich bibliography of authors for this idea. Our first question thus must be, how are we to think in and within the space of philosophical discourse the term and the theme of election? In which manner has this word, although not positively, integrated and entered the determined and circumscribed space of the philosophical tradition? These questions are perhaps erroneously posed. We ought here to formulate them otherwise. Why has the idea of election worked itself in and within philosophy? That is, in which manner has this idea, which is, and we shall see why, a radically heterogeneous concept for this tradition, inhabited the discourse, the logic, and even in a certain manner, the teleology of philosophy? Or again, from which place has the term election reached philosophical discourse? How did it ever find itself in the heart of philosophical logic? How did it come in philosophy and serve, as we shall see it, as the condition of philosophy, also as the condition of theology? We could say thus as the condition of both philosophy and theology, whilst distinguishing itself from the development or from the terminology of ontotheology. How is it that this word present and represent itself as the very principle, source, and lead of philosophy and of its theological temptation, whilst at the same time never ceasing to retract and dissimulate itself from both philosophical and theological appropriations? Before we enter into these questions, however, we ought to mark as clearly as possible in which manner the idea of election differs and projects discourse into a radically other sphere of language and intentionality. Other sphere of language than the one circumscribed by the classical logic of philosophy, which finds its meaning, its intelligibility in the possibility of grounding its knowledge and judgment on the self-assured basis of an identity whose process allows for a comprehension of all phenomenality. In other words, we ought here to explicate in which manner the idea, the term, or the word election differs radically from a phenomenon capable of being inscribed and determined, described and explicated under and within a horizon of philosophical comprehension or intentionality. Of course, this preliminary examination could and should be extremely lengthy, patient, and as exhaustive as possible. In order to render this thesis the justice it would require, we would need a good number of hours, perhaps an entire seminar, to firstly show with rigor and precision why the idea of election is not reducible to a concept, at least not to a philosophical concept. And thus, how and in which manner philosophical conceptualization incessantly reduces the breadth of the idea of election by transforming, transposing, transmuting its singular value and its particular radicality into the process of a recognizable universality. The time necessary to deploy this with care and rigor, we do not possess it at this particular moment. Suffice it to say, however, that the idea of election, contrary to most, perhaps even all classical or traditional philosophical concepts, does not belong to any instance in itself. The idea of election, properly said, does not have or possess an in itself. It is entirely and quite paradoxically always and already other to itself. That is, it is an idea in the sense that it always and already projects thought outside of itself by taking a hold of thought from that which is unseen and unforeseen by thought. Perhaps if there is another idea which could share a certain familiarity with the idea of election, it is the idea of revelation, a revelation which vertically overturns thinking or discourse by calling thinking and discourse to insistently project themselves outside of what they can or may signify. Hence, one cannot thoroughly grasp the idea of election philosophically, nor can one simply reappropriate it theologically. That is, one is always, in a certain manner, condemned to indirectly or obliquely approach this idea. Yet, this is precisely the task which lies ahead of us, to think that which overturns both philosophical and theological discourses, that is, think that which singularly requires philosophy and theology to shift radically their orientation. Or, in other words, think before philosophy and theology what elects, chooses, decides in philosophy and for theology. The idea of election, we are just hearing it, insistently misleads this distinction or the differentiation which we can trace from Aristotle to Heidegger between philosophy and theology, and hence between the receptivity or passivity of faith and the conceptual or reflexive activity of philosophy. The idea of election announces itself thus as that which outplays the necessary and inevitable difference of both philosophy and theology, but also outplays their mutual appropriation. The idea of election suspects thus both the identification and the differentiation of philosophy and theology. For it situates itself always and already before the exercise of each of these modalities of thinking. This before needs certainly to be explicated by saying that it is not simply marking an chronological antecedence to philosophy and theology. This before means more radically that election succeeds in at once suspending both theology and philosophy whilst projecting that which makes this possible as such towards another source of meaning irreducible to everything these two modalities of discourse could comprehend. Which means it gives rise to a more philosophical thought than any philosophy and to a theology more theological than any theology. That is to say, it gives rise to neither a philosophy nor a theology, since it opens in truth another gaze on the very logic and economy from which discourse separates itself necessarily between philosophy and theology, or confounds itself in and as philosophy and theology. In this manner, the thesis we would like to put forward is that the theme of election is a primary calling whose precedence is never graspable or comprehensible in and within the horizon of that which it gives rise to. To put it in simpler terms, what we seek to think here is the unfounded ground of both philosophy and theology as election. And furthermore, to think the idea of election as that which marks a beyond the presence of logos or the affirmation of theos, whilst at the same time also opening and awakening each of these philosophical and theological economies in their own deployment and development. In order to justify this hypothesis, we will concentrate on the idea of election as that which always projects thinking outside itself, what Levinas calls exposition of the subject, without ever grasping its resolution in a determined appropriation or philosophical comprehension. It means thus that the idea of election tirelessly projects thinking beyond that which it signifies as its own or its ownmost. Of course, as we have just said, the philosopher who most in the tradition marked the idea of election is Emmanuel Levinas. For Emmanuel Levinas, as we know, the idea of the infinite is properly said elective, in that it elects or awakens in the subject from outside the subject, projecting subjectivity to an incommensurable tension towards that which is never graspable in the intentional horizon of subjectivity, namely the other. Our idea of election finds its root, so to speak, in this Levinasian explication. In a certain manner, the idea of election, as we are slowly seeking to map out here, projects both philosophy and theology, taken as modalities of thinking which operate and conduct their own, both identical and differentiated teleology, into that which cannot reduce itself to a self-identity. The idea of election seeks, in this sense, to tear away, that is, also to dismantle the very tissue or context of an identifiable place, space, and circumscription, where concepts can or may organize themselves. And furthermore, the idea of election brings together, without ever comprehending them, the contradiction of philosophy and theology, but also any or all contradictory modalities, self and other, immanence and transcendence, particular and universal, etc., by incessantly retracting itself from either of these two discourses, and by also infinitely furnishing their very essence as discourses. The idea of election marks thus the very possibility of thinking at once and simultaneously philosophy and theology without seeking to comprehend and fuse together these two discourses. To think these two discourses in the possibility to reflect in which manner they constitute themselves in themselves and in their rapport. In this sense, the idea of election is always redefining the rapport between philosophy and theology. This maintaining of philosophy and theology, by guarding and safeguarding them from their collapse, arises from a very particular reading of Judaism, one inspired by Emmanuel Levinas. In this sense, Judaism requires the constant philosophical recall or evocation in and within itself, and forms a certain type of barrier or revocation of that which is mythological and theological. Hence, we can here grasp and understand the exceptional meeting between Jewish thought and philosophical reflection. This meeting calls for a radical demythologization of the text and a perpetual research in and within this process of demythologization of a critical stance where the theological is always and already dismantled, destructured. Emmanuel Levinas calls this demythologization of the already demythologized. À l'heure des nations. Quest of meaning, always and already renewed. The task, however, now is to open this process of demythologization to the work of a hermeneutic, that is, to the process of an interpretation. This interpretation must be at once and always political, social, juridical, and metaphysical. The formula from Rashi is often commented by Levinas. These verses cry, Darshenu. This seems to be the case today more than ever, here and elsewhere, as if Rashi's Darshenu was in fact a call to philosophize, a call to fold the text and to force the text to speak metaphysically in the sense of Levinas, that is, to let the radically other speak in and within the sameness, the radical plurality in and within the unity of the text. It is thus here important to begin by stating that never, for Emmanuel Levinas, can one acquiesce a return to theology per se. To state it bluntly and firmly, there is never for Levinas what Dominique Janicot called a theological turn. And for this reason, there is never in Levinas a discourse on God whose main line and structure grasps itself as and in a foundational ground. In other words, there is never in Levinas the affirmation of a theology. And this point is important, for if it is true that in Levinas there is a profound and incessant reworking of the anti-predicative, and this is in the purest of phenomenological traditions, this reworking can never be assimilated to an act of faith. It is rather entirely driven by the necessity to incessantly void and empty out the position which would rest and pose itself in and as faith. And it is precisely the idea of election which marks and advances, leads and furthers this movement of, we could say, deconstruction of faith. It is here thus that the idea of election orients thinking towards another possibility than the one marked by the antepredicative and anti-rational experience of faith. It opens the question of the subject, of a particular and singular subject, a subject which cannot and can no longer be related to or thought from intentionality. That is, a subject which must be related to its constitutive invisibility or its secret interiority, related thus to the possibility for it to be awakened by a calling of responsibility that it does not and cannot yet comprehend or initiate. That is, that it does not and cannot even think or determine as emanating from itself or from its autonomous decision. In this manner, for Levinas, we can only be blind in the constitution of the subject, whereas in a certain manner, nothing appears as subject which would require and lead into its description. Nothing is seen, no phenomena, no subject per se, which is called, solicited, commanded. The idea of election requires thus that the subject not yet be a subject, but be awoken to a subjectivity before any possibility is present or presented to it. This is why it is not a question here of intimidating philosophical anthropology, nor of negating away its phenomenological pursuit, but a type of return by a type of return to sacred words and religious dogmas, but to reflect on that which conditions each of these modalities of discourse. Conditions each of these modalities of discourse according to a logic which has, in a certain manner, no logical deployment. Rather, the inconditionality, as you all know, it's a word of Levinas, opened by the idea of election, works as the perpetual and incessant projection of that which suspends and animates each and every modality of discourse possible, that is, suspects or interrupts them and awakes and vivifies them. As if to say that the idea of election does not belong either to philosophy nor to anthropology, nor even to theology, but nonetheless affects each of these modalities of thought or discourse by awakening in them that which advances, produces them, proliferates them. It is in the sense that the idea of election is precisely linked to the idea of event. It is an event surpassing, exceeding philosophical anthropology, and thus the centrality of the anthropos, always re-questioning the predominance of the conatus essendi proper to being, and in which being itself is always and already preoccupied by itself and resting in itself. And consequently, this event of the election is also surpassing or exceeding sociological anthropology, by which is affirmed the originality of an ethnical particularism. And we must here add that after having been steeped in the Heideggerian critique of ontotheology, and most particularly after the Nietzschean critique of solidarity, of piety, and of the grace of an infinite and sublime gift as those hidden and dissimulated theological sources of moral philosophy, Levinas never engages his philosophy on the road of negative theology. Otherwise said, for Levinas, it is neither the reconduction of the God, to the God of a positive theology, nor it is the marking of a negative theology by which the rapport to God is always and already non-categorizable, nor is it the acceptance of some deity without name, like Marion would say, which would have been equated with a mystical knight. For Levinas, rather, it is the necessity to see in the idea of election the incessant affirmation of an infinite responsibility, which is always situated before any type whatsoever of categorization or of non-categorization. Consequently, and it is important to mark it, the suspension or the bracketing of the intentional attitude by the exposition to an election never opens for Levinas to an absolute idealism. Rather, what is opened by Levinas is a type of deepening, a radicalization, and consequently a step back in the face of all given, of all experience in its originary donation, What is meant here is that Levinas is in fact searching for a certain modality before and beyond the couple of passivity and activity, which is nonetheless not simply subjugated to any type of donation. This modality, neither passive nor active, because in fact coming before activity and passivity, is structured in a certain manner by the reversal of the logic, the entire logic of donation. What is given to the subject is in fact never given as such. This is why Levinas states that what is given before any phenomena is the commandment. A commandment, however, which is always and already exceeding the subject, exceeding both its capacity to receive and its ability to respond adequately to the commandment. In this manner, if we speak here of donation, it is only in the sense that the donation is non-original. That is, it does not situate or circumscribe the subject, but rather projects it in an undeterminable place of response and responsibility. It is in this manner that we are here tempted to see the idea of election working at once and simultaneously as a differentiating concept between Judaism and the nations, but also as a concept which properly shies away and in fact dismantles all or any forms of Jewish communitarism or ultranationalism. This differentiation, as we will see it, resolutely opens the singularity of the election to and towards the universal. The questions provoked by the idea of election in this movement, where it is made to condition both theological and philosophical discourses by never reducing itself to either of these, are in fact numerous. These touch all of our religious histories as well as our philosophical tradition. The idea of election is referred specifically to Judaism, but of course its reverberations will affect both Christianity and Islam. Of course, it would be much too presumptuous to attempt an exhaustive elaboration of these questions. Hence, we have decided for the purpose of this conference to focus on the following. First question: is the Judaic idea of election necessarily a particularism? This is the question of the definition of the idea of election. 2. What is the rapport between the Judaic idea of election and the universal? That is, what universal is proposed in and within the idea of election, and in which manner does Judaic election opens itself to the universal? This is the question of the rapport between Judaism and the other nations. 3. What seeks to retrieve and relieve, elevate, yes, in the Hegelian sense, the Judaic idea of election. That is, what can come in its place and in the name of which type of or comprehension of universalism? That is the question, David, of the rapport between Judaism and Christianity. 4. What is the rapport between the idea of election and the Levinasian election of the subject in the deposition of the self and the assignation to its responsibility for the other? And furthermore, what is the relation between the idea of election and the impossible return to the self, and thus the projection of a self outstripped and cast out from its self-consciousness, from its national body, from its autonomy? Does the idea of election mean a simple rapture provoked by the event of the other, or does it engage something wholly other? And furthermore, what does this wholly other imply politically? What could a wholly other responsibility determined by the idea of election mean? How could it formulate itself in a justice? This is the question of the future for and in a hyperbolical idea of election. It is from these questions that we will trace a few openings and evoke our conclusion relating Levinas to the prophetic figure of Ezekiel. The idea of election in Judaism is marked firstly and foremostly by the decision made by God and not by the people itself, according to its own self-determining will, to differentiate the people of the law from the other nations. The term which marks the difference is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is that which keeps and preserves the law. And thus, for Judaism, as Emmanuel Levinas marks it, means to keep the law which was refused by the other nations. The link between the law and the idea of election forms and constitutes the source and origin of the distinction between Judaism in the face of the other nations. It forms and constitutes the source and origin of the particularity of Judaism in the face of the other nations. This particularity, however, and since it is always and already marked by the conjunction law and election, is radically severed from any pretension to truth. In this manner, the Judaic election and consequently the particularism which arises from this election is by no means an affirmation of truth. This is very important. I repeat. The Judaic election and consequently the particularism which arises from this election is by no means an affirmation of truth. Levinas is not a philosopher of truth, okay? It is rather, he's a philosopher of justice. It is rather a persistent and incessant repetition of being subjugated to a law. This subjugation marks the constant projection or transcending outside of itself of the Judaic identity. Of course, we know in the history of philosophy that this projective transcending has been negatively interpreted, most particularly by Hegel, by Kant also. However, we wish to give, and contrarily to Hegel, a positive interpretation to this subjugation to the law. Positive interpretation meaning, of course, that the subjugation to the law is precisely that which marks the necessity to void and empty out, dismantle and destructure all forms of identification or incarnation, presentation or representation of the sacred. For the law is precisely that which is always and already, for Levinas, abstracted, removed, retracted from the concrete or effective manifestation. The law is always and already that which maintains itself removed from all or any form of concrete realization. The subjected subject is thus exposed to that which it cannot and does not see or presentify, the law. This rapport with an invisible law opens to an ethical signification, and thus an ethical signification is already and always implicit in the idea of election. This ethical signification is precisely that which marks the rapport between the particularism of the idea of election and the universal. Before entering into this report, we ought to further our analysis of the idea of election, which we interpret from Emmanuel Levinas, and thus be very attentive to the type of safeguard this idea marks, and in regards of the theological quest for the sacred, presentable and representable ground. In this sense, and Emmanuel Levinas marks it quite radically, the idea of election is always and already the counterpoint of the philosophical idea of determining the ground and the foundation of thought in the presence of the horizon of intentionality. Which leads into the following point: the idea of election is always and already that which cannot be appropriated or reappropriated by a foundation. To be elected is to be called without ground, without foundation, without concrete recognition of that which is electing. In the sense, one can only be elected, chosen, called, or commanded if one has neither the potentiality nor the effectivity to name that which is electing, choosing, calling, or commanding. Which means, as Emmanuel Levinas marks it, the idea of election is always and already to stand elected in an undeterminable foundation. This undeterminable foundation is named again by Levinas as being elected by the other, être élu par l'autre, and thus signifies prior to or ahead of any or all process of intentionality or signification that the subject is always and already responding before any or all engagement in the ontological order in advance of all contract. That is, the idea of election marks the advent of otherness in and within the very deployment of the subject. And thus, it marks the deployment of a subject always and already projecting itself outside of any all self-identical proposition or affirmation, autonomy or confirmation, a subject elected to be subjected to the other. Being elected means being exposed to the law, being exposed to the other in oneself as being riveted to the law, as that which removes and is removed, which voids and empties out all pretension to truth, to foundation, to the sacred, etc. It is here that is structured and constituted a rapport to the universal. from the singularity and the particularity of the idea of election is opened a rapport to the universal, which is not thought or conceptualized in the recognition of the singular by the universal. The traditional relation between singularity and the universal is in fact, regardless of where one begins, that the singular is always recognized by the universal and the universal always recognized by the singular. This is reciprocity, right? In this case, the rapport that is open with the idea of election is not reducible to the manner in which singularity and universality have been thought in the history of ontotheology. Differently thought, for the rapport here, which is arising between the singularity of the idea of election and the universality, is one in which the singularity of being exposed to the law is incessantly projecting its identity not in the structure of a possible recognition, Hegel, Kant, but rather in the perpetual tendency towards an infinite responsibility, guarded and safeguarded by it being absolutely non-recognizable as such. In this sense, the rapport between the singularity of the idea of election with the universal is made of that which does not and cannot subsume itself in the deployment of a horizon of meaning or recognition. Rather, this rapport is one in which the singularity of election pierces and transpierces the horizon of universality. This piercing and transpiercing of the horizon of universality by the singularity of the idea of election marks an ethical responsibility, that of responding to the undeterminable and undetermined. We'll return to this ethical responsibility. However, before we do, we must turn to the relation between Judaic idea of election and Christianity. כמה זמן נותר לי?
5 דקות.
אוי, אז אני לא מדבר על הנצרות, חבל. שתי משפטים בכל זאת, כי אני חושב שזה חשוב מאוד. אולי 4 משפטים? Okay. We cannot approach the idea of election without seeing how Judaism and Christianity abort it. And thus, we must enter into what ties and unites Judaism and Christianity. But how? It is not enough to state that the idea of election simply interrupts the Christian economy of love. It is not enough to simply assert that the idea of election breaks with the necessary scenes of reciprocity, of symmetry, of recognition. I could have added sacrifice, of course. Yes? Reciprocity, symmetry of recognition between man and God. And thus affirms the radical and unsubstitutable singularity. It is not enough, and we must add to this idea and mark that election always and already maintains its heteronomic and radical foreignness to the economical circle of love and sacrifice and forgiveness. And furthermore, if the idea of election must maintain in the face of love a certain distance, it is by inscribing what we could call here a rapport without rapport. For the idea of election in Judaism at once and at the same time authorizes and awakens the desire of its perpetual and incessant surpassing, that's Christianity, whilst opening to a radical supplementary projecting towards a resistance, this is Levinas for me, resistance to everything which happens in the name of this surpassing. What is here required is a certain manner of thinking the idea of election by seeing in this concept a certain type of hypercritical anticipation which would already and always seek to dismantle all and any economia of love, reconciliation, or reciprocity. This dismantling, however, ought not to be performed against these forms of economia, but rather in the incessant need to at once suspend their proliferation while constantly animating their movement. Okay, I move forward to the conclusion. In a certain manner, we are here explicating the very particular Judaic suspicion for the appearance of the face of God, and thus the doubt for the gratification of its proximity. These terms, the revelation of the face of God and the gratification of its proximity, will be always and already submitted to a hypercritical questioning. And the idea of election is precisely that which can stimulate such a critical interrogation. Why? since it is, as we have sketched it, by and through the idea of election that the meeting of God or the revelation of its place of residence are never as such rendered effective or concrete, for Levinas especially, right? They are never as such exhibited, designated, demonstrated. They are rather constantly, incessantly being projected outside of what they are to mean. That is, they are incessantly put into question and doubted in order to project them in the purely hypothetical, the purely other, than what they were made to signify in our tradition of thought. In the sense, the idea of election marks thus a certain antepredicative, which means anti-rational and anti-comprehensive suspicion for the Christian humanization of God, as well as for the phenomenalization of the divine. In this manner, and in this manner alone, the idea of election can advance a certain philosophical actualization of Judaism. We would wish to conclude on this point. The philosophical actualization of Judaism stems from the idea of election, which is never thus to be thought as the particularity of a privileged people, but rather as the deployment and the proliferation of a certain type of ambiguity and indecision of the very idea of election. That is, an ambiguity and indecision whereby the very logic of the idea of election is persistently and incessantly called to transform and transmute what is self-identical into that which projects itself outside self-identification, whereby the self-identical is quasi-immediately projected into its differentiation, its multiplicity, its wholly other plural meanings. And inversely, where the differentiated, the multiple, the plurality of other meanings is also as quasi-immediately as the first movement of differentiation reverted into a particularity. To be elected, chosen, is precisely being elected or chosen to carry or confront, to be exposed to this ambiguity and indecision. To carry or confront, to be exposed to the point where between identity and difference, between unity and multiplicity, the incessant indecidability, ambiguity of the two extremes of this structure carries its own ethical law, that of rendering justice to all that appears, all that is given and to all that is possible, to all that is not yet effective or concrete. It is by this not yet effective or concrete. Yes, Levinas is not Hegelian. Huh? It is by this idea that Judaism can be thought philosophically, as that event which at once and simultaneously maintains, animates, awakens the possibility of its others, and at the same time, almost as if to safeguard this possibility, retracts infinitely from what it projects, deploys, proposes, or offers. This justice which precedes truth and which truth supposes, Levinas mark this precedence and supposition as early as totality and infinity, thereby reversing the entirety of the philosophical tradition, which evidently places truth as the foundation of justice, evokes the idea of prophecy, which, of course, Levinas will link to the biblical figure of Ezekiel. The quotation is well known from Otherwise Than Being in the section entitled Témoignage et prophétisme. On peut appeler prophétisme ce retournement où la perception de l'ordre coïncide avec la signification de cet ordre faite par celui qui y obéit. Et ainsi, le prophétisme serait le psychisme même de l'âme. L'autre dans le même est toute la spiritualité de l'homme prophétique. L'infini ne s'annonce pas dans le témoignage comme thème, dans le signe fait à l'autre, où je me trouve arraché au secret de Gigès, pris par les cheveux, du fond de mon obscurité dans le dire sans dit de la sincérité, dont me voici d'emblée présent l'accusatif, je témoigne de l'infini. What is quoted and remembered here by Levinas is the singular situation by which Ezekiel is grabbed by the hair, and thus held back from returning to his own determining will or autonomous self, and in this sense suspended or interrupted from his involvement in the ontological sphere or order of cause and effect, of calling and response, of autonomy and necessity, in order to open towards a diachronical movement by which response for the other is always both too late on the calling of the other and already preceding the call of the other. As if the subject, the paradoxical Levinasian prophetic subjectivity, was always and already both called and not called. In fact, responding to a calling before all calling, and thus elected as responding to that which cannot be grasped in the circumference of, or the economy of a calling. Being elected as means for Levinas and Ezekiel will have been the figure of this thought, responding to that which is impossible to respond to, and which precisely opens to the infinitization of the response, its incondition, as Levinas reminds us of in Otherwise Than Being, but which always inhabits and haunts our response to the other. Thank you.